In the sweltering heart of Alexandria, where the Mediterranean kissed the shores of ancient Egypt, a forgotten princess watched as her world burned. The year was 48 BCE, and the greatest civilization the world had ever known stood on the precipice of collapse. But this was not a story about surrender. This was the tale of a young woman who would dare to challenge the most powerful empire on earth, who would crown herself pharaoh, and who would very nearly change the course of history itself. Her name was Arsinoe, the fourth of that name in the Ptolemaic dynasty, and for centuries her story has been buried beneath the shadow of her more famous sister, Cleopatra. Yet in the blood-soaked streets of Alexandria, in the desperate struggle for Egypt's throne, it was Arsinoe who proved to be Rome's most dangerous enemy. It was Arsinoe who commanded armies, who inspired loyalty, and who showed the world that Egypt would not bow without a fight. The Ptolemaic dynasty into which Arsinoe was born was already ancient by the standards of Rome. For 3 centuries, the descendants of Ptolemy, the Macedonian general who had claimed Egypt after Alexander's death, had ruled from Alexandria. They had built the greatest library the world had ever seen, transforming their capital into the intellectual heart of the Mediterranean. They had embraced Egyptian religion and custom while maintaining their Greek heritage, creating a unique fusion of cultures that dazzled visitors from across the known world. But by the time Arsinoe drew her first breath, sometime around 68 or 67 BCE, the golden age of the Ptolemies had long since faded. The dynasty that had once rivaled Rome itself had become dependent on Roman favor for its very survival. Civil wars, palace coups, and assassinations had become the standard method of succession. To be born into the royal family was to be born into a deadly game, where brothers murdered sisters, where children overthrew parents, and where trust was a luxury no one could afford. Arsinoe's father, Ptolemy XII, called Auletes, the flute player, was a king who understood his own weakness. He had spent a fortune bribing Roman politicians to recognize his claim to the throne, bankrupting Egypt's treasury to secure his crown. When his subjects rebelled against his incompetence and drove him from Alexandria, he fled to Rome, leaving his children behind. For young Arsinoe, this abandonment would have been her first lesson in the brutal realities of power. In the royal palace, surrounded by luxury yet trapped in a gilded cage, she would have learned to read the subtle signals of court politics, to identify allies and enemies, to understand that survival required both intelligence and ruthlessness. Her older sister Cleopatra was already positioning herself as their father's favorite, already learning the languages and diplomatic skills that would one day make her legendary. But Arsinoe was learning too, watching, waiting, understanding that in the Ptolemaic court the patient and the clever often outlived the bold and the reckless. When Ptolemy Auletes returned to Alexandria in 55 BCE, he brought with him Roman soldiers who reinstated him through violence and terror. The king's vengeance was swift and merciless. Those who had opposed him were hunted down and executed. The royal treasury, already depleted, was further drained to pay off Roman creditors. Egypt, once the breadbasket of the ancient world, was becoming a vassal state in all but name. For Arsinoe, now a teenager, the message was clear. Rome was the real power in the Mediterranean, and those who could not navigate Roman politics were doomed to be swept away. Yet there was another lesson in her father's restoration, one that perhaps only Arsinoe truly understood. The people of Alexandria had risen up once before. They had driven out a king. They could be rallied, they could be led, and they could be turned against Rome itself if the right leader emerged. The death of Ptolemy Auletes in 51 BCE set in motion the catastrophe that would define Arsinoe's life. According to tradition and the late king's will, the throne should have passed jointly to his eldest surviving children, the 18-year-old Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was perhaps 10 years old. Arsinoe and her younger brother Ptolemy XI were left without official roles, royal hostages to fate, their lives dependent on the whims of their siblings. Within 3 years, the arrangement had collapsed into civil war. Cleopatra, ambitious and brilliant, had attempted to sideline her brother and rule alone. The royal advisors, led by the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, responded by driving Cleopatra from Alexandria. She fled to Syria, where she began raising an army to retake her throne. Egypt was divided, brother against sister, and the kingdom teetered on the edge of chaos. Then Rome arrived, and everything changed. In the autumn of 48 BCE, Pompey the Great, fleeing from his rival Julius Caesar after a devastating defeat at Pharsalus, sailed into Alexandria's harbour, seeking refuge. The young Ptolemy XIII's advisors, believing they could curry favour with the victorious Caesar, made a decision that would shock the ancient world. They murdered Pompey, one of Rome's greatest generals, and presented his severed head to Caesar when the Roman dictator arrived days later. The advisors had miscalculated catastrophically. Caesar was horrified by the murder of his former son-in-law and fellow consul. More importantly, he saw in Egypt's chaos an opportunity. He would settle the dispute between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII personally, installing whichever sibling proved most useful to Rome. He took up residence in Alexandria's royal palace, declaring himself the arbiter of Egypt's fate. Cleopatra, ever the strategist, recognized her moment. In one of history's most famous episodes, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's presence, rolled up in a carpet or bedding. The meeting between the aging Roman dictator and the brilliant young queen would change both of their lives. Caesar, then 52, was captivated. Cleopatra, then 21, was fluent in multiple languages, educated in philosophy and rhetoric, and possessed a charisma that ancient sources describe as irresistible. Within days, they had become lovers. Within weeks, Caesar had declared his support for Cleopatra's claim to the throne. But declaring support and enforcing it were two very different things. Young Ptolemy XIII, backed by powerful advisors and a substantial Egyptian army, had no intention of surrendering power to his sister or submitting to Roman interference. The city of Alexandria, proud and fiercely independent, bristled at the presence of Roman legions in their streets. And in the royal palace, Princess Arsinoe watched these developments with growing alarm and recognition. Her sister had allied with Rome, had become Caesar's consort, and had chosen to rule as Rome's client rather than as Egypt's true sovereign. For Arsinoe, who had spent her entire life preparing for a moment that might never come, Caesar's arrival represented both danger and opportunity. At perhaps 19 or 20 years old, she understood that the old order was collapsing. Cleopatra had made her choice, binding Egypt's fate to Rome's favor. Ptolemy XIII was a child controlled by advisors. But Arsinoe, overlooked and underestimated, saw another path. If she could rally the Egyptian forces, if she could position herself as the alternative to both Roman interference and her siblings' failures, she might yet claim the throne. The question was whether she possessed the courage to seize the moment, and whether Egypt's people and soldiers would follow a young woman into rebellion against both her family and the might of Rome. The spark that ignited Alexandria came from an unexpected source. Caesar, with remarkable arrogance, demanded that the Egyptian government pay him the debts owed by Ptolemy Auletes. The sum was staggering, some 17 million sesterces, and the Egyptian advisors balked at the demand. Tensions in Alexandria escalated rapidly. Egyptian soldiers clashed with Caesar's legions in the streets. The Roman dictator, who had arrived with only a small force of perhaps 3,000 men, suddenly found himself besieged in the royal quarter of Alexandria, cut off from reinforcements and surrounded by a hostile city. What began as a political intervention had exploded into full-scale urban warfare. Caesar ordered his men to seize Alexandria's harbour and set fire to the Egyptian fleet to prevent it from being used against him. The fire spread, and in one of history's great tragedies, it reached the famous Library of Alexandria, destroying countless irreplaceable texts. As smoke rose over the city and Romans fought Egyptians in the streets, the Alexandrian War had begun. In this chaos, Arsinoe made her move. She fled the royal palace where Caesar had essentially kept the royal family under house arrest, escaping to join the Egyptian army that was besieging the Roman positions. The sources, written decades later by Romans who had little interest in honoring a woman who had opposed Caesar, provide few details of her escape, but the implications of what she did next are staggering. Arsinoe, a princess with no military experience and no official authority, somehow convinced the Egyptian army to accept her as their leader. In a dramatic ceremony, she declared herself pharaoh, taking the ancient titles that had belonged to rulers of Egypt for 3,000 years. She appointed as her general a man named Ganymedes, described by the Roman sources as her tutor, who would command the military campaign against Caesar. This was not the action of a frightened girl fleeing danger. This was a calculated political and military rebellion, a direct challenge to Roman authority and to her sister's claim to rule. The decision to crown Arsinoe was not merely symbolic. The Egyptian forces needed a figurehead who could claim legitimacy, someone from the royal bloodline who could unite the various factions opposing Rome. Arsinoe provided that legitimacy, but she also proved to be far more than a puppet. The ancient sources, hostile as they are, cannot help but reveal that she exercised real authority over the army. When her general Ganymedes clashed with the boy king Ptolemy XIII as advisors over strategy, it was Arsinoe who mediated the dispute and made final decisions. When military operations required approval, they came to Arsinoe. She was not merely a symbol, Times, and Desiglome. She was Egypt's pharaoh, in fact, as well as name, and she was at war with the most powerful military commander Rome had ever produced. The siege of Alexandria raged through the winter of 48 and into 47 BCE. Caesar, trapped in the royal quarter with his small force, was in genuine danger. He controlled the lighthouse and the palace complex, but the rest of Alexandria was in Egyptian hands. Arsinoe's forces, under Ganymedes' tactical command, fought with desperate determination. They attempted to poison Caesar's water supply by diverting seawater into the pipes that fed the Roman-held districts, forcing Caesar's men to dig wells. They launched repeated assaults on Roman positions, trying to overwhelm the defenders through sheer weight of numbers. They controlled the Heptastadion, the causeway that connected the mainland to Pharos Island, using it to launch attacks on Caesar's ships. For weeks, the outcome hung in balance. If the Egyptians could break through, or if Caesar's supplies ran out before reinforcements arrived, the greatest general of Rome would fall in the streets of Alexandria, and Arsinoe would have achieved what no other enemy of Rome had managed. Caesar himself, in his account of the war written years later, described the fighting as among the most difficult of his career. He was nearly killed multiple times, once forced to swim for his life when his boat was sunk during a naval skirmish. His men were exhausted, fighting not only against trained soldiers, but against an entire city that viewed them as invaders. And behind the Egyptian military strategy was Arsinoe, the forgotten princess who had transformed herself into pharaoh and war leader. The Roman sources would later minimize her role, attributing the military decisions to Ganymedes and other male commanders. But the pattern is clear in the historical record. Before Arsinoe's arrival, the Egyptian forces had been divided and ineffective. After she took command, they nearly defeated Caesar himself. The political dimension of Arsinoe's rebellion was equally sophisticated. She understood that legitimacy mattered, that symbols and tradition held power. By declaring herself pharaoh, she had not simply claimed a title. She had invoked 3,000 years of Egyptian sovereignty, positioning herself as the defender of Egyptian independence against foreign conquest. This was not just a dynastic struggle between siblings. This was framed as Egypt's resistance against Rome, and that framing resonated powerfully with the Alexandrian population and the Egyptian army. Where Cleopatra had chosen collaboration with Caesar, Arsinoe offered defiance. Where Ptolemy XIII was controlled by advisors, Arsinoe claimed direct authority. She represented something that neither of her siblings could claim: an Egypt that stood on its own, that fought for itself, that refused to become another Roman client state. Yet Arsinoe also faced the brutal mathematics of ancient warfare. Caesar, despite being outnumbered and besieged, was a military genius with veteran soldiers who had conquered Gaul and defeated Pompey. As winter turned to spring in 47 BCE, Roman reinforcements began arriving. First came supplies by sea, then additional legions marching overland. The balance of forces shifted inexorably in Caesar's favor. The Egyptian army, for all its size and determination, lacked the discipline and training of Roman legions. Ganymedes, whatever his abilities as a commander, was facing one of history's greatest military minds. The siege, which had come so close to success, began to crumble. In a desperate attempt to break the deadlock, the Egyptian advisors of young Ptolemy XIII requested that Caesar release the boy king, claiming that he would negotiate peace between the warring parties. Caesar, in a move that demonstrated either remarkable confidence or strategic calculation, agreed. Ptolemy XIII was allowed to leave the palace and join the Egyptian army. But if the Egyptians hoped that the boy king's presence would unite their forces, they were disappointed. Instead, Ptolemy's arrival created new divisions. He and his advisors clashed with Arsinoe's faction over command and strategy. The Egyptian army, which had fought cohesively under Arsinoe's leadership, began to fracture. This internal division would prove fatal. Caesar, seizing the moment of Egyptian disarray, launched a decisive offensive. His reinforced legions, now numbering perhaps 10,000 men, broke out of the palace district and pushed into the city. The Egyptian army, caught between internal political struggles and external military pressure, began to collapse. The final battle took place near the Nile Delta, where Caesar's forces routed the Egyptian army. Young Ptolemy XIII, attempting to flee the battlefield, drowned in the Nile when his boat capsized under the weight of refugees. At age 13 or 14, he died without having truly ruled, a puppet to the end. For Arsinoe, defeat meant capture. As the Egyptian forces surrendered or scattered, she was taken prisoner by Caesar's soldiers. The sources do not record her words or actions in that moment, but we can imagine the bitter realization of how close she had come. For months, she had held Caesar at bay. She had commanded armies, ruled as pharaoh, and nearly accomplished what seemed impossible. But nearly was not enough. The Roman legions had prevailed, and with them, Cleopatra's claim to the throne. Egypt's brief moment of defiant resistance was over. Caesar's treatment of his captives revealed much about Roman politics and power. Arsinoe, who had come closest to defeating him, who had proven herself a capable military and political leader, was not executed. Instead, Caesar decided to take her to Rome, where she would be displayed in his triumph, the grand parade that celebrated Roman victories. This decision was simultaneously pragmatic and cruel. Executing a Ptolemaic princess might create a martyr and provoke further Egyptian resistance. But displaying her in chains, parading her through Rome's streets as a defeated enemy, would serve as a warning to anyone who dared oppose Roman power. It would also eliminate her as a potential rival to Cleopatra, who now ruled Egypt as Caesar's consort and client. Before leaving Alexandria, Caesar resolved the question of Egypt's throne with characteristic decisiveness. Cleopatra would rule as queen, but she would not rule alone. Egyptian tradition demanded that the pharaoh have a co-ruler, and with Ptolemy XIII dead and Arsinoe captive, only one royal sibling remained. Ptolemy XI, the youngest of the four, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, was elevated to become Cleopatra's co-ruler and nominal husband. It was a purely ceremonial arrangement. The real power lay with Cleopatra, and behind her, with Caesar and Rome. The brief moment when Arsinoe had offered Egypt an alternative path was closed. The kingdom's independence, already compromised, was now effectively surrendered. Egypt would be ruled by a queen who owed her throne to Roman military might, and the price of that throne was Egyptian sovereignty itself. For Arsinoe, the journey to Rome must have been a nightmare of anticipation and dread. Chained and guarded, transported across the Mediterranean on Roman ships, she would have had months to contemplate her fate. She had worn the double crown of Egypt, had commanded armies, and had nearly defeated Caesar himself. Now she was reduced to a prisoner, a trophy to be displayed for the entertainment of Roman crowds. The sources suggest she maintained her dignity throughout the voyage, neither begging for mercy nor breaking under the psychological pressure of her captivity. She had been pharaoh, and she would face whatever came with the bearing of royalty, even in defeat. The triumph took place in 46 BCE, after Caesar had defeated the last remnants of Pompey's supporters in North Africa. It was a spectacle unlike anything Rome had ever seen, a 4-day celebration of Caesar's victories in Gaul, Egypt, North Africa, and Asia. Captives from across the empire were paraded through the streets, along with displays of looted treasure, paintings depicting battles, and placards describing Caesar's conquests. The crowd, hundreds of thousands of Romans lining the streets, came to cheer their victorious general and to witness the humiliation of Rome's enemies. Among those captives was Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who had led the great rebellion against Caesar in Gaul. After being displayed in the triumph, he would be strangled in Rome's Tullianum prison, the traditional fate of defeated enemy leaders. But when Arsinoe appeared in the triumph, something unexpected happened. The ancient historian Cassius Dio records that the crowd's reaction was not celebration, but pity. Here was a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, from one of the ancient world's great dynasties, being paraded in golden chains as a defeated enemy. To the Roman crowd, accustomed to seeing captured barbarian chieftains and enemy kings in triumphs, the sight of a young Ptolemaic princess in chains was shocking. Arsinoe represented Egypt, the land of pharaohs and pyramids, a civilization far older and more prestigious than Rome itself. To see her reduced to this state may have troubled even Romans who celebrated their empire's conquests. The sources suggest that the crowd's sympathy was so pronounced that Caesar, sensitive to public opinion, decided not to execute her. This moment represented something extraordinary in Roman history. Triumphs were designed to celebrate Roman supremacy, to show conquered peoples that resistance was futile, and to reinforce the power of the victorious general. Yet here the crowd, moved by pity or perhaps by recognition of what Arsinoe represented, refused to play their assigned role. Whether they were responding to her youth, her gender, her dignity in captivity, or the symbolic weight of her Ptolemaic heritage, they saw in her not just a defeated enemy, but something more complex and troubling. In their pity, there may have been an unconscious acknowledgement that what Rome was doing to ancient kingdoms like Egypt was not simply conquest, but the destruction of worlds. Caesar's decision to spare Arsinoe's life was unprecedented for a triumph. Enemy leaders who appeared in these celebrations were almost always executed immediately afterward, strangled in prison as the culmination of Rome's victory. But Caesar, the master politician, understood that executing Arsinoe after the crowd had shown such sympathy would be a political mistake. Instead, he ordered her exiled to Ephesus in Asia Minor, where she would live under the protection of the Temple of Artemis. This was not mercy in any meaningful sense. It was a different kind of prison, a life of permanent exile and surveillance, cut off from Egypt and from any possibility of reclaiming her throne. But it was life, and for someone who had come as close to execution as possible, that alone was a kind of victory. In Ephesus, one of the great cities of the ancient world, Arsinoe entered a strange limbo between royalty and captivity. The Temple of Artemis, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, traditionally offered sanctuary to those seeking refuge. As a suppliant under the temple's protection, Arsinoe could not be easily seized or harmed. She would have been given quarters within the temple complex, supported by temple funds, allowing a measure of dignity appropriate to her royal birth. But she was also trapped. Leaving the temple would end her sacred protection and expose her to arrest or assassination. She was a princess without a kingdom, a pharaoh without subjects, a woman whose brief moment of power had ended in defeat and exile. Yet Arsinoe remained dangerous precisely because of who she was. As long as she lived, she represented an alternative to Cleopatra's rule. Any Egyptian faction unhappy with Cleopatra's governance or her subservience to Rome could potentially rally around Arsinoe. She was the sister who had fought Rome, who had defied the most powerful empire in the world, who had briefly held Caesar at bay. Her mere existence was a threat to the stability of Cleopatra's regime and to Rome's interests in Egypt. This reality would have been obvious to everyone involved, most especially to Cleopatra herself. The years Arsinoe spent in Ephesus remain largely undocumented. The ancient sources, focused on the great events of Roman politics and Caesar's campaigns, had little interest in the exile of a defeated princess. But we can reconstruct something of her situation from what we know of temple sanctuaries and the lives of royal exiles. She would have been watched constantly, her movements reported to Roman authorities and likely to Cleopatra's agents in Asia Minor. Any attempt to contact Egyptian sympathizers or to build political alliances would have been detected and reported. She was alive but powerless, surviving but not living, a ghost of what she had once been. In Rome and Alexandria, events moved swiftly. Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March, 44 BCE, stabbed to death by senators who feared he was becoming a king. Cleopatra, who had been living in Rome as Caesar's honored guest, fled back to Egypt with her young son Caesarion, whom she claimed was Caesar's child. Egypt was plunged back into uncertainty as Rome descended into civil war. Mark Antony, Caesar's lieutenant and ally, emerged as one of the three men vying to control the Roman world. By 41 BCE, Antony had taken control of Rome's eastern provinces, and he summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus. The meeting between Antony and Cleopatra would become legendary, another famous love story between Egypt's queen and a powerful Roman. But for Cleopatra, securing Antony's support was not just about romance. It was about survival and securing her throne against all potential rivals. Arsinoe, living in exile in Ephesus, represented the most dangerous of those rivals. Cleopatra understood that as long as her younger sister lived, her own position was vulnerable. If Rome's civil wars shifted power away from Antony, if Egyptian factions decided to support an alternative claimant, if any of a dozen political circumstances changed, Arsinoe could become pharaoh again. The sister, who had once commanded armies and nearly defeated Caesar, could not be allowed to remain a permanent threat. According to the ancient sources, Cleopatra requested that Antony deal with Arsinoe permanently. The argument she would have made was coldly logical. Arsinoe had rebelled once. She had proven herself capable and dangerous. She would always be a focus for dissent and opposition. Stability in Egypt, which Rome desperately needed to secure the grain supply that fed the empire, required eliminating this threat. Mark Antony, besotted with Cleopatra and dependent on Egyptian resources for his military campaigns, agreed. He sent soldiers to Ephesus with orders to seize Arsinoe from the temple of Artemis and execute her. This was an extraordinary act. Temple sanctuary was one of the most sacred protections in the ancient world. To violate it was to commit sacrilege, to offend the gods themselves. But Rome, at the height of its power, cared little for such traditions when they conflicted with political necessity. The soldiers entered the temple of Artemis, seized Arsinoe, and killed her on the temple steps. She was perhaps 27 or 28 years old. She had been pharaoh for only a few months, 15 years earlier, and she had spent most of her adult life in exile. Now, she was dead, murdered to secure her sister's throne, another casualty in the endless dynastic violence of the Ptolemaic dynasty. The execution shocked the ancient world. Violating temple sanctuary to kill a royal exile was an act of breathtaking arrogance and brutality. It demonstrated that Rome, and by extension Cleopatra, would stop at nothing to maintain power. For the people of Ephesus, it was a desecration of their most sacred space. For those who remembered Arsinoe's brief reign and her defiance of Rome, It was a bitter reminder that resistance, no matter how courageous, ultimately failed against Rome's overwhelming might. The young woman who had dared to challenge Caesar, who had worn the double crown and commanded armies, had been reduced to a victim of political calculation, murdered far from home to satisfy her sister's paranoia and Rome's hunger for stability. For centuries, Arsinoe's story was largely forgotten. The historical sources, written by Romans who had no interest in celebrating someone who had fought against Caesar and been killed at Antony's command, minimized her achievements and ignored her significance. When historians mentioned her at all, it was as a minor figure in Cleopatra's story, a rebellious sister who had been justly defeated and removed. Cleopatra, with her famous relationships with Caesar and Antony, with her dramatic suicide after the Battle of Actium, became one of history's most iconic figures. Arsinoe faded into obscurity, remembered if at all as a footnote to her sister's legend. The pharaoh who had fought Rome, who had held Caesar at bay in Alexandria, who had shown that Egypt could still resist, vanished from history's pages. But Arsinoe's story did not truly end with her death. In 1926, in the ruins of Ephesus, Austrian archaeologists discovered a remarkable octagonal tomb structure. It was unusual in its design, clearly built for someone of importance. Inscriptions and architectural details suggested it dated to the mid-1st century BCE. For decades, scholars debated the tomb's purpose and who might be buried there. Then, in the 1992, excavations revealed skeletal remains of a young woman, buried with honors appropriate to royalty. Forensic analysis suggested she had been in her 20s when she died, and that she showed signs of being of mixed ancestry, consistent with the Ptolemaic dynasty's Macedonian and possibly Egyptian heritage. The location, the dating, the architectural significance, and the forensic evidence all pointed to one conclusion. This was very likely the tomb of Arsinoe IV, the forgotten pharaoh who had defied Rome. The discovery of Arsinoe's tomb did more than provide archaeological confirmation of her existence. It sparked renewed interest in her story and a reassessment of her historical significance. Modern scholars, re-examining the ancient sources with fresh eyes, began to recognize what had been obscured by centuries of Roman and male-centered historical writing. Arsinoe had not been a minor figure or a puppet controlled by male advisors. She had been a political and military leader in her own right, capable of inspiring loyalty, making strategic decisions, and very nearly defeating one of history's greatest generals. Her brief reign represented something profoundly important, a moment when Egypt stood against Rome, when a young woman claimed power on her own terms, and when resistance, however ultimately futile, was still possible. The story of Arsinoe IV resonates today because it speaks to fundamental questions about power, resistance, and historical memory. In a world dominated by empire, by overwhelming military force, by the inexorable expansion of dominant powers, what does meaningful resistance look like? Arsinoe's answer was clear. You fight. You claim your legitimacy. You refuse to accept that might make right. You defend your people's sovereignty, even when the odds are impossible. She knew she was facing Rome at the height of its power. She knew Caesar's reputation. She understood the risks. Yet she chose to crown herself pharaoh, to lead armies, to turn Alexandria into a battlefield rather than surrender Egypt's independence without a fight. There is something profoundly moving in her choice. She was not guaranteed success. History suggests she was almost certainly doomed from the start. Rome was too powerful, Caesar too skilled, the mathematics of ancient warfare too unforgiving. Yet she fought anyway. And in fighting, she created a moment when things might have been different. If Caesar had fallen in Alexandria, if the siege had succeeded, the entire trajectory of Roman history might have changed. The Roman civil wars might have taken a different course. Cleopatra might never have had her chance to rule. Egypt might have maintained its independence for another generation. We can never know what might have been, but Arsinoe's resistance opened that possibility, creating that moment when the future was uncertain, when Egypt's fate was not yet sealed. Her story also illuminates the particular challenges faced by women who claimed power in the ancient world. Arsinoe did not inherit the throne through normal succession. She seized it through political and military action, convincing hardened soldiers and cynical politicians to follow a young woman into rebellion. In a world where women were expected to be pawns in male political games, where their value was measured in marriage alliances and heirs, Arsinoe claimed agency and authority. She did not ask permission to rule. She declared herself pharaoh and dared anyone to challenge her claim. The fact that she succeeded even briefly, that she held command over armies and cities, suggests extraordinary force of personality and political skill. The ancient sources written by men who were uncomfortable with powerful women tried to diminish her role, attributing her achievements to male advisors. But the pattern of events makes clear that Arsinoe was the leader, not a figurehead. The contrast with her sister Cleopatra is instructive. Cleopatra's path to power ran through alliance with powerful Roman men. She secured her throne by becoming Caesar's consort, maintained it through her relationship with Antony, and ultimately lost it when Octavian defeated Antony at Actium. Cleopatra was brilliant, educated, politically sophisticated, and undeniably capable, but her power was always mediated through Roman favor. She ruled Egypt as Rome's client, and when Rome turned against her, she had no alternative. Arsinoe chose a different path. She positioned herself as Egypt's defender against Rome, as the alternative to collaboration and subservience. Her path led to defeat and death, but it was her path, chosen on her own terms. The question of which sister made the wiser choice is perhaps unanswerable. Cleopatra ruled for decades and became legendary. Arsinoe ruled for months and was forgotten. Yet there is something to be said for defiance, for resistance, for refusing to accept that surrender is the only option. The murder of Arsinoe on the steps of the Temple of Artemis represents one of history's great crimes, not just against her personally, but against the values that even ancient societies claimed to hold sacred. Temple sanctuary was supposed to be inviolable. It was the ultimate refuge, the place where even the most desperate fugitive could find safety from vengeance and political violence. By violating that sanctuary, Mark Antony and Cleopatra demonstrated that power recognizes no limits, that political expedience trumps sacred law, that the strong can do what they will and the weak must suffer what they must. The citizens of Ephesus who witnessed Arsinoe's murder would have understood the message. Rome's power extended everywhere. No sanctuary was truly safe. No tradition was strong enough to protect you if you threatened Roman interests. Yet in the very brutality of her death, there is an acknowledgement of Arsinoe's significance. Cleopatra ordered her sister's murder because Arsinoe was dangerous, because even 15 years after her defeat, even in exile and powerless, she represented a threat that had to be eliminated. People remembered the young pharaoh who had defied Caesar. They remembered the siege of Alexandria when Egypt had nearly thrown off Roman domination. As long as Arsinoe lived, that memory remained alive, a spark that might reignite into rebellion. Only death could extinguish that spark completely. In ordering that death, Cleopatra revealed her own insecurity and the fundamental weakness of her position. She ruled only through Roman support, and she knew it. Arsinoe, who had claimed power in defiance of Rome, could never be allowed to live because she represented everything Cleopatra's reign was not: Egyptian sovereignty, resistance to foreign domination, and legitimacy earned through courage rather than collaboration. The rediscovery of Arsinoe's tomb in Ephesus brought her story full circle. For 2,000 years she had been forgotten, her achievements erased, her courage dismissed as insignificant rebellion. But archaeology, that most physical of historical sciences, restored her to visibility. The octagonal tomb, carefully constructed, architecturally significant, positioned prominently in one of the ancient world's greatest cities, was a monument to a woman who mattered. Whoever built it, whether sympathizers from Egypt or Romans who felt guilt over her murder, or citizens of Ephesus honoring a victim of Roman brutality, They ensured that Arsinoe would not be completely forgotten. They could not record her name in inscriptions that might be erased. They could not write histories that might be burned. But they could build a structure that would endure, and in its endurance, bear witness. Modern forensic analysis of the remains found in the tomb provided additional insights into Arsinoe's life and death. The skeletal structure suggested someone who had lived a relatively privileged life with good nutrition, consistent with royal status. The age at death, estimated in the 20s, matched the historical timeline. Most poignantly, there were indications that the death may have been violent, though the specifics are impossible to determine after 2 millennia. What the bones confirm is that this was a real person, not just a name in ancient texts. Arsinoe lived, breathed, fought, suffered, and died. She was flesh and blood, and her bones endured when everything else was taken from her. In the 2 decades since the tomb's excavation and analysis, Arsinoe has begun to reclaim her place in history. Scholars of ancient Egypt and the Ptolemaic period now recognize her as a significant figure in her own right, not merely Cleopatra's forgotten sister. Her brief reign is understood as a crucial moment in the final years of Egyptian independence, a last gasp of resistance before the kingdom was fully absorbed into the Roman Empire. Her story has begun to appear in popular histories, documentaries, and academic studies. She is being remembered, and in that remembering, she is receiving the recognition that was denied to her in her own time. What would Arsinoe think if she could see this rehabilitation of her reputation? Would she care that 2,000 years later, people are finally telling her story, finally acknowledging what she accomplished? Perhaps not. She fought for Egypt's independence in her own time, against impossible odds, knowing that defeat was likely, but fighting anyway. The judgment of future historians was probably the least of her concerns as she commanded the siege of Alexandria or as she faced execution in Ephesus. She lived in the moment, made her choices, and accepted the consequences. That is all any of us can do, and in her case, she did it with remarkable courage and determination. Yet there is value in remembering her, not for her sake, but for ours. Arsinoe's story reminds us that history is full of forgotten figures who shaped events, who made crucial choices, who demonstrated courage and capability, but were erased from the historical record because they opposed the powerful or because their gender made their achievements invisible to male chroniclers. How many other Arsinoes are there in history, brilliant women whose stories were never recorded or whose achievements were attributed to men? How many acts of resistance and defiance were dismissed as insignificant because they ultimately failed? The historical record is not an objective account of what happened. It is a narrative constructed by the victors, shaped by the biases and limitations of those who wrote it down, and full of absences where stories were never told or were deliberately suppressed. Arsinoe's story also speaks to the nature of empire and resistance. Rome presented itself as bringing civilization, order, and peace to the Mediterranean world. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was held up as a great achievement, an end to the chaos of warring kingdoms and constant conflict. But that peace came at the cost of independence for dozens of nations and peoples. Egypt, with its 3,000 years of continuous civilization, was reduced to a Roman province, its wealth extracted to feed Rome's population and fund its armies. The Ptolemaic dynasty, despite all its flaws, had maintained Egypt's identity as a sovereign kingdom. After Cleopatra's death, that sovereignty was extinguished. Egypt became just another territory in Rome's vast empire, administered by Roman governors, its culture and traditions gradually eroding under Roman influence. Arsinoe's resistance, brief and ultimately unsuccessful as it was, represents a rejection of that imperial logic. She fought for Egypt's right to determine its own fate, to be ruled by its own leaders, to maintain its sovereignty in the face of overwhelming force. Her defeat was inevitable given the balance of power in the 1st century BCE, but the fact that she fought at all matters. It matters because it demonstrates that even in the face of seemingly unstoppable imperial expansion, people chose to resist. It matters because it shows that not everyone accepted Rome's right to conquer and rule. It matters because it preserves the memory that there were alternatives, that the Roman Empire was not welcomed by all, that the famous Pax Romana was built on the subjugation of proud and ancient peoples who did not go quietly into that Roman night. In our own time, when questions of empire, sovereignty, and resistance remain as relevant as ever, Arsinoe's story offers both inspiration and warning. The inspiration comes from her courage, her refusal to accept what might make right, her willingness to fight for her people's independence even when victory seemed impossible. The warning comes from her fate, the reminder that resistance against overwhelming power often ends in defeat and death, that the empire is ruthless with those who oppose it, that the price of defiance can be total destruction. Yet even knowing that price, even understanding that the odds were against her, Arsinoe chose to fight. That choice, and the brief moment when she held Caesar at bay in Alexandria, represents something precious: the assertion of human agency against the grinding machinery of empire, the declaration that some things are worth fighting for even in the face of certain defeat. The octagonal tomb in Ephesus stands today as a monument to that choice. Tourists visiting the ruins of one of the ancient world's greatest cities can see the structure that most likely houses Arsinoe's remains. It is not as famous as Cleopatra's monuments, not as visited as the pyramids of Egypt, not as celebrated as the ruins of Alexandria. But it endures, a silent witness to a woman who was pharaoh, who commanded armies, who fought the most powerful empire in the world, and who was murdered for refusing to be forgotten. In its quiet endurance through 2 millennia, it carries forward her story, ensuring that someday someone would ask, who was buried here? Why does this tomb exist? What story is it trying to tell? Now we know the answers to those questions. Arsinoe IV, daughter of Ptolemy XII, sister of Cleopatra VII, pharaoh of Egypt for a few short months, in 48 and 47 BCE, military commander who besieged Julius Caesar in Alexandria, exile who survived in Ephesus for 15 years, and finally, victim of political murder on the steps of the Temple of Artemis. She was all of these things, and she was more than any of them. She was a woman who refused to accept the role history had assigned her, who claimed power when it was not offered, who fought when surrender would have been easier, and who paid the ultimate price for her choices. Her story intersects with some of history's most famous figures and events. She fought against Julius Caesar at the height of his power. She was paraded in the triumph that celebrated his greatest victories. She was murdered on the orders of Mark Antony to secure Cleopatra's throne. She lived through the death throes of the Roman Republic and the birth of the Roman Empire. She witnessed the final decades of Egyptian independence before the kingdom was absorbed into Rome's empire. She was present, active, and significant during one of history's great turning points, yet for centuries she was invisible, her name known only to specialists, her achievements minimized or attributed to others. What makes her story particularly poignant is how close she came to changing history. The siege of Alexandria was a desperate, brutal affair, and Caesar himself admitted it was one of his most difficult campaigns. If Arsinoe's forces had broken through, if Caesar had been killed or forced to surrender, everything that followed would have been different. There would have been no Cleopatra and Caesar, no Caesarion, no Cleopatra and Antony. The Roman civil wars would have taken a different course. Egypt might have maintained its independence for another generation or more. The very map of the ancient world could have been redrawn. All of this hung in the balance during those months when Arsinoe's Egyptian army fought Caesar's Roman legions in the streets of Alexandria. She came within an inch of victory, within a hair's breadth of changing everything. That she ultimately failed does not diminish the significance of how close she came. There is also something deeply human in her story that transcends the grand sweep of history and politics. She was a young woman, probably not yet 20, when she crowned herself pharaoh, who found herself in an impossible situation and made the best choices she could with the information and resources available to her. She was brave but not suicidal. She was ambitious but not merely self-serving. She fought for her crown, yes, but she also fought for Egypt's sovereignty, for her people's right to be ruled by their own leaders rather than by foreign conquerors. When she was defeated, she maintained her dignity in captivity and exile. When she was murdered, she died far from home, cut off from family and country, alone except for whatever servants or companions had followed her into exile. It was a lonely, bitter end to a life that had promised so much more. Yet in that end, there is also a kind of vindication. Cleopatra, who ordered Arsinoe's death to secure her own power, ultimately lost everything. Her alliance with Mark Antony ended in defeat at the Battle of Actium in 31 BCE. She committed suicide rather than be paraded in Octavian's triumph, as she had seen Arsinoe paraded in Caesar's. Her son Caesarion was hunted down and killed. Her remaining children were taken to Rome and raised as Roman citizens, their Egyptian heritage erased. Egypt itself became a Roman province, ruled by Roman governors, its wealth extracted to feed Rome's population. Everything Cleopatra had fought for, every compromise she had made with Rome, every alliance she had crafted, came to nothing. She had murdered her sister to secure a throne that she ultimately could not keep. The collaboration that Cleopatra represented, the attempt to maintain power through alliance with Rome, proved no more successful than Arsinoe's defiance. Both sisters ended up dead, both dynasties extinct, both paths leading to the same destination, Roman conquest and Egyptian subjugation. But there is a difference in how they are remembered. Cleopatra became famous, the subject of countless plays, films, novels, and historical studies. Her name is known to everyone. Yet she is famous primarily for her relationships with powerful Roman men, for her beauty and seduction, for her dramatic suicide. Her actual political and administrative abilities, which were considerable, are often overshadowed by the romantic narratives. Arsinoe, forgotten for centuries, is now beginning to be remembered for what she actually did: command armies, lead resistance, fight Rome. Her story is not about romance or seduction. It is about courage, leadership, and defiance. In that sense, the rediscovery of her story represents a kind of justice, a restoration of recognition for achievements that deserve to be remembered on their own terms. The comparison between the sisters should not be pushed too far. They made different choices based on different circumstances and different assessments of what was possible. Cleopatra was older, more experienced, and perhaps more realistic about Rome's power. Arsinoe was younger, more idealistic, and perhaps more willing to risk everything on a desperate gamble. Neither path was clearly superior. Both women were trying to navigate an impossible situation, caught between Egypt's decline and Rome's rise, between the demands of their Ptolemaic heritage and the realities of Mediterranean geopolitics. They chose differently, and both paid terrible prices for their choices. There is tragedy enough in their stories without needing to declare one right and the other wrong. What we can say, with the benefit of 2,000 years of hindsight, is that Arsinoe's story deserves to be told and remembered. She was not a minor figure. She was not simply Cleopatra's rebellious sister. She was a pharaoh who commanded armies, who held one of history's greatest generals at bay, who inspired loyalty and devotion, who fought for her people's sovereignty, and who paid for her courage with exile and death. Her story is part of Egypt's history, part of Rome's history, and part of the larger human story of resistance to empire and the struggle for self-determination. For too long, that story was lost, buried beneath centuries of historical neglect and the biases of ancient sources. Now, thanks to archaeology and renewed scholarly interest, Arsinoe is emerging from obscurity. She is being recognized, studied, and honored. Her tomb in Ephesus has become a site of historical interest. Her name appears in books and articles. Her story is being told to new generations who can appreciate her courage and significance. There is something fitting in the fact that it was archaeology that restored Arsinoe to history. The ancient texts, written by Romans and focused on the famous figures of their world, had largely erased her. But the physical evidence, the tomb, and the bones it contained, could not be erased. They endured through all the centuries of forgetting, waiting to tell their story. When modern science finally examined them, they spoke with their own kind of truth, a truth more fundamental than the narratives of historians. They said, "Here was a person. Here was someone who mattered. Here was a life that deserves to be remembered." And slowly, the world is beginning to listen. For those who visit Ephesus today, who walk among the ruins of the ancient city and see the octagonal tomb, Arsinoe's story adds a layer of meaning to the experience. This was not just any ancient city. This was where a pharaoh lived in exile and died by assassination. This was where Rome's power reached across the Mediterranean to silence a woman who had dared to resist. This was where, despite everything, a monument was built that would outlast empires, that would carry forward a story that needed to be told. The tomb is not grand by the standards of Egyptian or Roman architecture. It is not a pyramid or a mausoleum, but it is dignified, carefully constructed, and enduring. In those qualities, perhaps it reflects the woman it honors. Not ostentatious but impressive, not overwhelming but memorable, not famous but worthy of fame. As the sun sets over the ruins of Ephesus, as shadows lengthen across the ancient stones, it is possible to imagine Arsinoe as she might have been during her years of exile. A young woman far from home, surrounded by the foreign temples and markets of a Greek city, living under the protection of sanctuary, but knowing that protection was fragile, that her sister in Egypt and the Romans who controlled the Mediterranean would never truly forget about her. Did she think about Alexandria during those years? Did she remember the months when she had been pharaoh, when soldiers had saluted her and called her queen, when she had commanded armies and fought Rome itself? Did she regret her choices, or did she face exile with the same determination she had shown in war? We cannot know her thoughts. The sources are silent about her inner life, about her hopes and fears and dreams, but we can imagine, and in imagining, we honor her humanity. She was not just a historical figure or a name in ancient texts. She was a person who lived and felt and thought and chose, and those choices mattered. Arsinoe's story ends in Ephesus, on the steps of the Temple of Artemis, with a brutal murder that violated every standard of ancient law and religion. But in a larger sense, her story does not end. It continues in the tomb that houses her remains. It continues in the work of archaeologists and historians who study her life. It continues in books and articles and documentaries that tell her story. It continues in the minds of everyone who learns about her and recognizes her significance. She fought Rome and lost, but her story has outlived Rome itself. The empire that seemed unstoppable in her time collapsed centuries ago. The Romans who dismissed her as a defeated rebel are dust. But Arsinoe endures in memory and monument, in bone and stone, in the stubborn persistence of truth that refuses to be completely buried. There is a lesson in that endurance. Power is temporary. The empire rises and falls, the mighty are brought low, and the forgotten are sometimes rediscovered. What seems immutable in one era becomes ancient history in the next. But stories persist. The courage of a young woman who became pharaoh and fought impossible odds, that story has power that transcends the centuries. It speaks to something fundamental in the human spirit, the refusal to surrender without resistance, the determination to stand for what you believe, even when standing seems futile. Arsinoe stood, and in standing she created a moment that echoes across time. For anyone who feels overwhelmed by the power of empires, by the weight of historical forces too large to resist, by the sense that individual action cannot matter against such overwhelming odds, Arsinoe's story offers perspective. She faced the greatest military power the ancient world had ever known. She fought one of history's legendary generals. She commanded armies while barely out of her teens. She nearly won, and when she lost, She maintained her dignity and her identity even in defeat and exile and death. If that is not courage, if that is not strength, if that is not worthy of remembrance and honor, then what is? She was not perfect. She made choices that might be questioned. But she was brave and determined and willing to fight for what she believed in, and those qualities deserve recognition. The African queen who outsmarted the Romans, at least for a while, who made Caesar himself struggle to subdue a single city, who showed that Egypt would not surrender its sovereignty without a fight, that queen was Arsinoe IV, not Cleopatra, for all her fame, not the sister who allied with Rome, but the sister who defied it. Cleopatra's story has been told 1,000 times. Now, finally, it is time for Arsinoe's story to be told as well. Time for the forgotten pharaoh to be remembered. Time for the young woman who became a warrior and a ruler, who fought impossible odds and paid the ultimate price to receive the recognition she deserves. Her tomb stands in Ephesus. Her bones rest in museum storage, but her story, her courage, her defiance, and her determination live on. And in living on, they remind us that even in the darkest times, even against the most overwhelming power, resistance is possible. Fighting back is possible. Standing for what you believe in is possible. It may not guarantee victory, it may not prevent tragedy, but it matters. It has always mattered, and as long as people remember Arsinoe, as long as her story is told, it will continue to matter. She was a pharaoh, she was a warrior, she was a woman who refused to surrender, and she deserves to be remembered.